Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about a fruit that once caused more panic than poison mushrooms, more suspicion than a neighbor's goat walking backwards, and more drama than a royal marriage scandal. Yesternight's sleepy story is about tomatoes, not the juicy ones on your sandwich, not the canned ones in grandma's pantry, but the first tomatoes to land on European soil, back when they weren't food. They were fear. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this in bed, tell me what city you're in and what time it is down below. I love seeing where you're drifting off from now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in a market square in Seville, Spain. The year is 1540. The air smells like citrus and smoke. A ship from the New World has just docked, and among the cargo chili peppers, tobacco. Some very tired sailors. There's a wooden crate filled with something strange. They're red, glossy, round, not apples, not pomegranates, something else. And the locals are staring like these things might blink. You don't know it yet, but you are witnessing the European debut of Solanum like a persicum the tomato, and it's not going to be a warm welcome. Some say the conquistadors brought them back as a novelty. Others claim they were seeds mixed in with medicinal herbs. History isn't sure. What we do know is that the first reactions were ... skeptical ... very skeptical ... to the average 16th century European. The tomato looked suspicious, too red, too shiny, too soft. It was different. And different, in those days, often meant dangerous. People had seen enough with belladonna, mandrake root, and nightshade berries, deadly plants with juicy berries that look a little too much like tomatoes. You remember those, don't you? The kind witches supposedly used in potions. The kind that made your great-uncle's cousin hallucinate a choir of frogs before he fell into a nap and never woke up. So now imagine someone handing you a tomato and saying, "Here, eat this." Would you? The tomato quickly earned nicknames: the devil's fruit, the poison apple. In German, some even called it Liebesapfel, or love apple, because they thought it was dangerous and seductive. Which is somehow worse. People grew them in gardens, sure, but not for eating. They were admired, gossiped about, and, above all, feared. It didn't help that the first people to try them were often wealthy nobles. And unfortunately, those nobles often got sick after eating them. The tomato was blamed, but the truth was more complicated, and we'll get to that in the next section. So here you are, standing among a crowd of murmuring townsfolk, staring at this weird red orb from a faraway land. You're not hungry anymore. You're curious, a little anxious, maybe even a little afraid. After all, it looks like it's watching you back. You've done it. Against your better judgment, you've brought one of those strange red fruits home. It's sitting on your wooden kitchen table, next to a loaf of yesterday's bread and a slightly skeptical-looking cat. You poked the tomato once. It doesn't scream. So far, so good. Then you hear the neighbor yelling. Not at you, at his wife, who has just planted a tomato vine in their herb garden. He's convinced it will kill the rosemary just by proximity. It's evil, he shouts, waving a walking stick at the innocent plant. It's cursed. This, believe it or not, was a fairly common attitude. You see, tomatoes belong to a botanical family that already had a very bad PR problem. Solanaceae, the nightshade family. And oh, what a dramatic family it is. Alongside tomatoes, you've got mandrake, the screaming rout of legend, henbane, hallucinations for days, and deadly nightshade. The name kind of says it all. All of these were associated with witches, poisoners, and mysterious disappearances in the woods. So when people realized tomatoes were a cousin to these, they assumed the worst. Like, the kind of worst, where if you touch it, your soul might dissolve. But here's the twist. The tomato is not poisonous, at least. Not the part people eat. The leaves and stems do contain small amounts of tomatine, a compound that in very large quantities might make you sick. But the fruit itself, safe. Still, 16th century Europeans didn't have biochemistry textbooks. What they did have were local gossip circles, religious suspicion, and centuries of folk beliefs. And those things spread faster than facts. Let's add one more layer of drama. In the early days of tomato eating, only the wealthy were bold or foolish enough to try them. And many of those wealthy people ate from pewter plates, a kind of shiny, stylish metalware made from tin and lead. Now, here's where things get truly tragicomic. Tomatoes are acidic, and when acidic food sits on lead-rich plates, it can leach the lead into the food. You already know where this is going. People ate tomatoes, people got sick, and sometimes they died. Naturally, no one blamed the plates. To the average observer, it looked like tomatoes were literally poisoning rich people, a darkly satisfying idea for the poor, and a deeply terrifying one for everyone else. That reputation stuck. In some countries, tomatoes were banned. In others, priests gave warnings. Stay away from the red temptation, some declared. Only the devil gives you food that looks like blood. That's a real quote from a sermon in southern France. Okay, Finnett's paraphrased, but the vibe was very much there. You sit back, watching your untouched tomato glisten in the candlelight. You're not sure anymore. It smells sweet, almost inviting, but it's red, too red, and you've heard enough stories to hesitate. You wonder if the cat wants it. The cat does not want it. Outside, the wind rustles through the garden. The tomato plant sways. For just a second, it looks like it bows toward your window, or maybe you're just tired. Hey, let's be honest for a second. When was the last time you blamed your dinnerware for your stomachache? Probably never. But if you were an aristocrat in 17th century Europe, you definitely should have. Because your plates weren't just decorative. They were silently, elegantly trying to kill you. You're invited to a banquet tonight. Long waxy tables, 10 courses, every dish garnished with suspiciously small portions. But you're fancy now, remember? You eat on pewter. A cool soft gray metal with just the right amount of shine to make your guests whisper, wow, they must be important. What you don't know is that your beautiful plate is 30% lead. Not a sprinkle of lead, not a whisper of lead. A full-on slab of neurological disaster. And tonight's salad, it has tomatoes. The tomato still, an exotic novelty, sits, sliced and artfully arranged, in the center of your dish. Its juice slowly seeps into the pewter surface, and without a word, chemistry takes over. The acid in the tomato dissolves lead, ions off the plate, straight into your food. You take a bite. Tastes like wealth. And also, unbeknownst to you, irreversible damage. The next morning, you feel off, nausea, headache, a sense that your dreams were filled with falling clocks, and voices speaking backwards. Could be the wine, you think? Could be the full moon. Could be the tomato dot, and just like that, a pattern is born. Tomatoes made nobles sick. Nobles told everyone. Everyone decided tomatoes were cursed. Of course, no one blames the plate. Plates don't grow in the dirt. Plates don't look red like blood. Plates don't sound like devil's fruit in Latin. No. The problem must be the tomato, and because it's new, it's also defenseless. You see, the tomato has no reputation to lean on, no saints eating it, no royal chef endorsing it, no folksies saying like a tomato a day keeps the plague away. It's naked in its newness, and nothing is scarier to a superstitious society than the unfamiliar. We like our food like we like our neighbors, predictable, slightly boring, and unlikely to curse us before breakfast. But not everyone avoids it. Some scholars get curious. Some monks try growing it in monastery gardens, carefully, from a distance. With gloves, a few herbalists start whispering, "It might be good for your digestion," while their friends whisper back, "So was leeching." Look where that got us. The debate grows. Is it food? Is it poison? Is it ornamental? Yes, that last one sticks. For nearly a century, tomatoes are mostly grown as decorative plants. Something to admire in a windowsill, not to serve with cheese. Rich people display them like conversation pieces. Look at this exotic thing from the New World. Isn't it dangerous? Would you like to touch it? Just don't eat it unless you want to. Test fate. Meanwhile, in southern Europe, especially Italy and Spain, people begin to tiptoe across the culinary line. Not nobles, but peasants, farmers, gardeners, the people who already eat things close to the ground and don't have pewter plates to blame. They eat tomatoes, and nothing bad happens. But their stories don't travel far. They're poor. They don't write cookbooks. And when they do talk, the elite aren't listening. It takes decades, even centuries, for word to spread. Still, every time a noble faints after a tomato dish, the myth deepens. And so tonight, you stare down at your own pewter plate. You imagine the tomato's juice sizzling, whispering to the metal. Maybe you shouldn't eat it after all. But something about that fruit draws your eye. It glows in the candlelight, ripe with mystery, part danger, part dinner. Just don't lick the plate. You've had enough of nobility fainting into their soup. So you pack your bags, lace up your dusty boots, and head south where the sun is warmer. The food is simpler, and, just maybe, the tomatoes are a little less suspicious. Welcome to southern Italy. It's the late 1600s. The streets smell like garlic and wood smoke. The buildings are warm with sandstone, and old women in aprons argue in rapid dialect while weaving through hanging laundry. And in a small backyard garden behind a crumbling stone house, there's a tomato vine curling its way up a wooden trellis, bold and red as if it's always belonged there. Here, nobody screams when they see one. You watch a boy pluck a ripe tomato, wipe it on his sleeve, and bite into it like it's an apple. He doesn't die. He doesn't even flinch. He just grins, red juice dripping down his chin, and runs off to chase a chicken. Something is different here. It starts with class. In the North, food trends are dictated by nobility. But here in the South, where life is slower and meals are communal, food changes from the bottom up. And peasants aren't so afraid of trying new things, especially if they grow easily and taste like summer and tomatoes. Tomatoes love this place. The soil is volcanic and rich. The sunlight is practically an herb. The vines grow fast. The fruit swells juicy. And the flavor is unlike anything else on the table. Soon, they're being tossed into stews, crushed into sauces, and layered between bits of bread. Quietly, experimentally. No cookbooks. Just recipes passed by word of mouth, like secrets. You're invited to one such meal. A bowl of steaming flatbread, a drizzle of olive oil, a handful of crushed tomato, and salt. You take a bite, your eyes widen. It's tangy, bright, alive, like you just ate the sun, and no one gets sick. There's no plate of pewter, just wood and clay and worn hands. The meal ends in laughter, and you realize something important. Fear has a harder time surviving where food is shared. Still, this tomato underground isn't public knowledge. In Paris, people still scoff. In London, tomatoes are mostly decoration. In Germany, they're barely grown at all. But here in Naples, in Palermo, in Bari, they're making their quiet conquest. It begins to trickle northward. Slowly, one family sends seeds to a cousin. A merchant hears about a sauce so good it made someone weep. A traveler from Florence tastes a tomato stew in a village and can't stop thinking about it for weeks. But like all revolutions, it takes time. In fact, it takes war. During the 18th century, Europe is constantly fighting something, nations arguing over borders, kings flexing for glory, empires shifting like tectonic plates, armies move, supplies run low, and people start eating what's available. Sometimes, that means tomatoes. A soldier stationed in southern Italy learns to survive on flatbread and stewed vegetables. When he returns home, he craves that taste. He tries to recreate it. He tells his wife. His wife tells her neighbor. Her neighbor starts a garden, and just like that, tomatoes slip past centuries of suspicion and into the mouths of people who were once told they'd drop dead if they dared. But the rumors don't vanish overnight. Even now, in your rented room, above a Sicilian tavern, you can overhear the barkeep muttering, "My cousin says they still cause fevers if you eat too many." And someone else whispers, "They'll rot your teeth if you don't boil them." It's not science. It's survival gossip. But change is coming. And the tomato, it's not just a garnish anymore. It's becoming culture. And all it took was a little hunger, a lot of sunshine, and people willing to ignore what the rich folks said. As you drift off to sleep on your straw mattress, you think of the little red fruit growing in a garden downstairs. You don't feel fear anymore. You feel hungry. Asterisk, the year is 1735. You're in a small town nestled in the folds of central Italy. There's no war here today, no grand banquet, no royal decree about what's fashionable to eat, just lunch. Humble, honest, unremarkable lunch. You sit on a wooden stool beside an open hearth. An old woman, her hands permanently scented with basil and smoke, stirs a bubbling pot. She doesn't say what's in it. You're told to wait. You obey. The scent is warm, acidic, earthy. Something sweet, something sharp. When she finally ladles it into a bowl and passes it to you, you notice it's red. Not blood red. More like the red of autumn apples or rusted brick after a storm. There's bread to scoop with. No forks. No ceremony. You taste it. You blink. There. It is the tomato. Not raw, not risky, but roasted into something deeper. Cooked down with onion and oil, it clings to your tongue like a story you haven't heard before. You don't say a word. You just keep eating. Across the region, scenes like this are happening in hundreds of kitchens, quietly, because the tomato isn't arriving in triumph. It's sneaking in through the back door. No noble has declared it fashionable. No medical society has retracted its warnings. No clergy has blessed it. But it's here anyway, because it's delicious. Because it grows well. Because people are tired of living in fear of a fruit. And yet, in cookbooks, silence. The earliest mentions are timid. A 1745 Neapolitan manuscript mentions a sauce made from certain red fruits used to dress macaroni. The writer doesn't call them tomatoes. He doesn't say they're safe. He just lists them, like you might mention a strange cousin at a family reunion politely, and without making eye contact. Why? Because admitting you cook with tomatoes still feels a little rebellious. It's hard to explain to modern sensibilities. But imagine someone today writing a recipe that included, say, cicadas, or dandelion root, or something recently declared not poisonous but still looked down on by everyone in your social circle. That's what the tomato is, a culinary wild card. Still, it persists. It simmers. It wins hearts, one simmering stew at a time. A traveling priest tastes it in a village. He likes it, but doesn't admit it. A visiting merchant has it with grilled fish. He buys seeds on the way home. A baker hears someone describing it and tries to imagine what it would taste like with bread. And so, recipes begin to spread. But verbally, you need oil, garlic, and that red thing from the garden. No, not the pepper, the squishy one. Yes, that. No one writes it down because writing makes it official. And no one wants to be officially weird, until someone does. In 1760, a daring cook includes a full recipe for salsa al pomodoro in a handwritten notebook. No fanfare, no apology, just steps. Slice tomatoes, remove skins, heat with oil and onion. That's it. History changes quietly, sometimes with just 4 lines of instructions in the margin. You imagine this recipe being passed to a cousin, then a friend, then copied in another book. then changed a little, maybe add a bay leaf, maybe try it with fish. By 1780, you've got dozens of variations floating through southern Italy like red whispers. Meanwhile, northern cities start catching on, but up there, the approach is different, more cautious. More French. Tomatoes are turned into jellies, into glazes, into things that look pretty on a silver spoon. But the passion, that's still down south. In Naples, it's not about fashion, it's about flavor and practicality. The poor can grow tomatoes. They don't need landowners' approval. They can preserve them for winter. They can boil them into sauce and stretch one dish to feed 7 mouths. In this way, tomatoes become not just food, but survival. And with every bite, the old myths lose power. The nobility may still scoff, the doctors may still debate, but in kitchens with soot-dark walls and wooden spoons passed down like heirlooms, the tomato has found a home. It's not loud, it doesn't need to be. Asterisk, you're now in an aristocratic villa. Marble floors, frescoed ceilings, and a dining room so ornate, it feels like you're supposed to whisper in Latin just to enter. At the head of the table sits a nobleman, with a powdered wig, a waistcoat tighter than your future, and a plate of untouched food in front of him. On that plate, tomatoes. But he doesn't eat them. In fact, no one at the table does. They're arranged in a perfect circle, sliced like a sacrifice. Decorative, symbolic, but untasted. Why? Because of pewter. See, the myth goes like this. Tomatoes used to kill people because of the plates they were served on. Rich people in the 17th and 18th centuries often used pewter dishware, which contained high amounts of lead. The tomato, being acidic, would leach lead from the metal. Guests would then consume both tomato and toxin, fall ill, and occasionally die. Tomatoes took the blame. Pewter got off scot-free. It's a compelling story. You almost believe it. Almost accept. Scholars still argue whether it actually happened. On one hand, yes, acidic foods can react with lead. Yes, lead poisoning was rampant among the wealthy, causing everything from stomach pain to memory loss to death. And yes, tomatoes are fairly acidic. But on the other hand, there's very little direct evidence of this tomato plus pewter equals doom combo being widely documented in its own time. Most of what we know comes from retrospection, from 19th century scientists and 20th century writers trying to reverse engineer why people feared tomatoes. So, while it's entirely possible that some folks got sick from eating tomatoes off fancy plates, it's also possible that this story became a convenient scapegoat. A neat little tale, an explanation that made everyone feel smarter without really solving anything. You look at the nobleman again. He's sipping wine. His cheeks are slightly gray. His fork is silver, but his plate, pewter, definitely pewter. You don't say anything, because, even if the myth is shaky, it speaks to a deeper truth. When people don't understand something, they blame what they can see. The tomato was new. The plate was old. When something went wrong, it had to be the tomato's fault. You step out of the villa and walk down the garden path. In the orchard, a servant is eating a tomato straight from the vine. She doesn't have a plate, just fingers, just hunger. She's fine, and that's the divide. The poor eat tomatoes and live. The rich place them on pewter and perish. Or at least, that's the story. It doesn't help that around this time, tomatoes were lumped into the same family as nightshades plants, historically associated with poison, madness, and witchcraft. Belladonna, henbane, mandrake, fungis. Tomatoes, with their shiny skin and unusual vines, looked a bit too magical, too foreign, too suspect, so the myth of the poison plate flourished. It gave people a reason to keep tomatoes at arm's length, a reason grounded in science-wise sounding words like acidity and metals. And once people had a rational explanation, they clung to it even if it wasn't completely true. But in quieter corners of Italy, Spain, and even France, cooks were beginning to figure it out. Use wooden bowls, clay pots, iron pans, no pewter, and suddenly, no problem. And so, a quiet revolution began, not with declarations, but with cookware choices. You imagine a 1760s kitchen, a grandmother stirring tomato sauce in a terracotta pot, muttering under her breath that pewter was never to be trusted. Not because she read it in a science journal, but because her neighbor's cousin's uncle once got a rash, and that's all the evidence she needed. And really, that's how food history moves, through superstition, stories, and so is the poison plate story true? Maybe, maybe not, but it stuck. And like many myths, it says more about fear than it does about facts. Tonight, as you rest under a quilt made of stories, you think about how often we choose the simple explanation, the one that sounds smart but lets us stay scared. And somewhere, another tomato ripens in the sun, unaware it's being slandered at a nobleman's table. Asterisk, let's take a detour. Not to Italy, not to France, but to China. You're standing on a bustling dock in 17th century Fujian. Boats creak under the weight of salted fish, barrels of soy paste, and ceramic jars filled with a dark, umami-rich sauce. Locals call it ketchup. It's tangy, fermented, slightly fishy, and absolutely tomato-free. Then, along come European merchants, Dutch, British, Portuguese, all hoping to make a profit and pretending they can pronounce local words. One of them tastes ketchup, finds it strange, but oddly compelling. He bottles some, takes it home, slaps a label on it that reads something like exotic Eastern sauce. Back in Europe, this ketchup, eventually mispronounced into ketchup, starts popping up in cookbooks. But it changes. The fermented fishiness is too strong for British palates. So cooks start tweaking the recipe. Add mushrooms, walnuts, anchovies, anything but tomatoes. Yes, that's right. The earliest ketchup had 0 tomatoes. You glance at a 1742 English recipe to make ketchup in the fashion of the East Indies. It involves vinegar, shallots, mace, cloves, and 10 days of fermentation. The result, more like Worcestershire sauce than anything you'd put on fries. Then something curious happens. As tomatoes sneaks their way into European gardens and kitchens, some bold soul thinks, what if I made ketchup, but red? They try. They adjust. They reduce the vinegar, increase the sugar, toss in some allspice, and just like that, tomato ketchup is born. But it doesn't take over right away. You walk into a London tavern in 1805 and ask for ketchup. The barkeep hands you a cloudy bottle that smells like old mushrooms. Tomato ketchup is still the weird one. It's not until the 19th century, especially in America, that tomato ketchup becomes dominant. In 1812, a Philadelphia scientist named James Mees writes down the first known recipe for tomato-based ketchup. He calls tomatoes love apples, which is adorable and totally unhelpful. His recipe includes tomato pulp, spices, and brandy. Yes, because if you're going to make history, you might as well be tipsy. This tomato ketchup is thicker, sweeter, and much more shelf-stable than its ancestors. It catches on slowly, then faster. By the mid-1800s, it's in restaurants, then bottles, then everywhere but the ketchup you know today. That only arrived with Henry J. Heinz. You're in Pittsburgh now. 1876. Heinz has a problem. Americans like ketchup, but it keeps spoiling on store shelves. Preservatives like sodium benzoate are effective but controversial. Some say they're unhealthy. Others just hate the taste. So Heinz does the unthinkable. He removes the preservatives. Instead, he makes the ketchup more acidic and sugary, using only ripe tomatoes, which contain more natural pectin and flavor. It's thick, it's glossy, it's redder than a fire truck, and sweeter than first love. Heinz markets it as pure and wholesome, which ironically is what people feared tomatoes would never be. And Americans eat it up. Literally now. Rewind. Imagine telling a Italian farmer that one day, people would squeeze a tomato-based sauce onto beef patties and fried potatoes. That this once feared fruit would become the most consumed condiment in the Western world. He would laugh, then offer you some cheese. Meanwhile, in China, ketchup continues in its original form. Locals never stopped using it. They just watched. The West rebranded with tomatoes and wondered why everyone insisted on putting it on eggs. So, what's the moral here? Sometimes, what you think is traditional is just what got the best PR. Ketchup isn't a tomato thing. It's a story of cultural borrowing, linguistic butchery, and trial and error cooking. A sauce that changed its entire identity to fit the tastes of whoever adopted it. Today, you squirt ketchup onto a plate without thinking. It's bright, it's smooth. It tastes like childhood. But once, it was fermented fish sauce from a distant dock in China. And once, it didn't have a single tomato in it. Asterisk, you find yourself in a dusty apothecary. Somewhere in the American countryside, around 1830. The shelves are lined with glass bottles, labeled in tight script: liver tonic, elixir of life, snake oil, guaranteed. In the corner, under a handwritten sign that says new, scientific, marvel, sits a jar of thick, dark red paste. Dr. Miles tomato pills. Yes, that's right. Pills, made from tomatoes. For a time, tomatoes weren't just food, they were medicine. And in the early 19th century, when medical knowledge was a chaotic stew of half-truths and wishful thinking, tomatoes gained a reputation as a cure-all. A man named Dr. John Cook, Bennett physician, showman, and PR genius, was a key figure in this movement. Around 1834, he published a series of articles claiming tomatoes could treat diarrhea, indigestion, bile disorders, and even cholera. He insisted that tomatoes stimulated the liver and purified the blood, which, at the time, was as medically profound as saying aligns your chakras is today. You imagine him in a grand hall, mustache curled, speaking to a rapt audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this humble fruit, nay, this botanical miracle can cleanse your very soul. Did it work? Who knows? What we do know is that the public loved it. Tomato-based patent medicines exploded in popularity. Pills, extracts, pastes, some with actual tomato, some with, let's call it, essence of hope. It was the era of medical entrepreneurship, where marketing mattered more than molecules. Of course, actual doctors were divided. Some agreed that tomatoes, being rich in acids and vitamins, probably aided digestion and general wellness. Others scoffed, dismissing it as vegetable nonsense. And still others tried to outdo each other in tomato enthusiasm, creating concoctions with names like tomato electuary and solanum syrup. One enthusiastic manufacturer even claimed his tomato pills could eliminate melancholy and restore masculine vigor, which sounds suspiciously like an ad you'd scroll past at 2 a.m. You walk through towns where posters showed cherubic children holding up tomatoes like holy relics. You pass general stores with entire displays devoted to Dr. Root's tomato elixir, and in every home, someone swears by it. Saved my cousin from the dropsy, they'll say. Cured my neighbor's gloom, says another. It's tomato mania. But there's a darker undercurrent, because this is also the time when arsenic and mercury were common ingredients in medicine. Bleeding patients with leeches was still in fashion, and purgatives were sold to cleanse your system, usually by forcing you to vomit or worse. So, compared to that, tomatoes probably did feel like a healing miracle. At least they didn't kill you. You sit on a porch beside an old man who claims he hasn't been sick since he started eating tomatoes every day. He leans in and whispers, "Doctor says it's the lycopene. I think it's the hope." And maybe he's not wrong, because half of healing, as it turns out, is belief. Eventually, as medical science caught up, the tomato pills faded away. Real studies showed that yes, tomatoes contain vitamins A and C, potassium, and antioxidants like lycopene. Good for the heart, good for the skin, good for making you feel like you're doing something healthy even if you just ate 4 slices of pizza. But they're not magical. Still, a strange fondness lingers. Even today, in the age of probiotics and wearables, you'll find health blogs praising the detoxifying powers of tomato juice. TikTok influencers swear by tomato face masks. And once again, tomatoes are part of the performance of wellness. So tonight, as you sip your herbal tea and prepare to drift off, think of all those who came before downing tomato capsules by candlelight, whispering thanks to a fruit they didn't quite understand, but desperately wanted to believe in. Sometimes, healing isn't about evidence, it's about hope in a red wrapper. You're standing in a well-to-do kitchen in 18th century Europe. The walls are lined with gleaming copper pots. The air smells faintly of bay leaves and meat stock. On the cutting board lies a small red fruit plump, shiny, suspicious. A tomato, and no one wants to touch it. Why? Because, in this elegant kitchen, tomatoes are considered poison, deadly, dangerous, fit only for decoration, or witches. Let's rewind. During the 1700s, tomatoes began spreading through Europe, brought back from the Americas, centuries earlier. But despite their arrival, many Europeans, especially the wealthy, believed tomatoes were toxic. The reason? Pewter, you see. The rich loved pewter tableware. Pewter has a dull silvery gleam and was used for plates, cups, and even utensils. The catch? It's an alloy made mostly of tin and often laced with lead. Now imagine placing a juicy, acidic tomato on a lead-heavy pewter plate. The acid begins to react with the lead, drawing it out just enough to cause slow, creeping lead poisoning. The symptoms: nausea, fatigue, tremors, memory loss, maybe even death. Of course, no one blamed the plates. They blamed the fruit. You lift a tomato. It looks healthy enough. But stories swirl of noblemen who fell sick after eating devil's apples, of cooks fired for adding it to soup, of old wives insisting that tomatoes curdle the blood. And so, the tomato becomes a scapegoat. In some circles, it's even accused of being hallucinogenic or aphrodisiac. Two very different fears, but equally scandalous. The term poison apple sticks around. The tomato's reputation sours. Meanwhile, peasants, those clever, practical folks, are cooking tomatoes into stews without issue. Why? Because they use clay or wooden dishes. No lead, no poisoning. Just rustic good sense. So we end up with a bizarre divide. The rich, who could afford the fanciest kitchens, are scared of tomatoes. The poor, who make do with scraps and earthen bowls, are happily simmering tomato rag. You walk through a marketplace. One stall refuses to sell tomatoes. Another claims they ward off curses. A third offers tomato seeds with handwritten warnings. Use with caution. Do not eat raw. And yet, beneath the paranoia, curiosity brews. A few adventurous chefs start experimenting. A tomato reduction here, a chutney there. Recipes appear in secretive corners of cookbooks, coded cautious. Fruit of the New World, sliced thin, cooked well. It takes decades to shift the narrative. Scientific understanding improves. Lead poisoning is better understood. Tomatoes tested, tasted, and still delicious slowly begin their redemption arc. By the late 18th century, attitudes soften. In Italy, tomatoes are embraced more openly. In France, the idea of a tomato sauce becomes less terrifying, more tantalizing. In England, you hear murmurs in culinary circles. Perhaps we judged it too harshly, but fear doesn't disappear easily. Even in the 19th century, some households still believe tomatoes upset the humors, especially when eaten raw, and in certain pockets of society, tomatoes remain a source of whispered concern. You return to the kitchen. The same tomato lies on the board, sunlight hitting its red skin like a dare. This time, you slice it, gently, carefully, and nothing bad happens, because As with many foods throughout history, the problem wasn't the ingredient, it was the context. The fear wasn't about the tomato. It was about what we didn't understand, and that's kind of comforting, isn't it? To know that tomatoes weren't hated for what they were, because we didn't know how to hold them. So next time you add tomatoes to your lunch, maybe whisper a small apology on behalf of your ancestors. They didn't mean it. They were just scared. Asterisk, you're walking through a medieval garden in southern Spain. The air is thick with rosemary and thyme. Bees buzz lazily in the warm sun. You pause near a patch of strange-looking vines twisting hairy, topped with small greenish fruit. The gardener leans over and says, "Don't eat those. They're love apples. Love apples." You blink. That, it turns out, is one of the earliest European names for the tomato. Pomme d'amour in French, pomodoro in Italian, and in English, a loose translation, love, apple. It sounds poetic, romantic, and wildly inaccurate. Why love? No one's entirely sure. Some say it was due to the tomato's heart-like shape. Others suggest it was linked to the old belief that tomatoes were an aphrodisiac. One theory says the name was simply borrowed from a different fruit and got stuck. Like most good historical myths, it's layered, muddled, and persistent. You imagine a dinner guest lifting a tomato slice and winking, "Careful now. One bite, and you might fall in love." Beyond the romance, names mattered. In an age where global trade was just taking off, and new foods were arriving from unfamiliar lands, naming was a way of controlling the unknown. A name could domesticate fear. Love apple was easier to swallow than suspicious red fruit from the land of cannibals. But not everyone was convinced. Other names weren't so friendly. In Germany, tomatoes were sometimes called Wolfpfirsich, wolf peach. Why? Because of an ancient superstition that wolves avoided the plant. There's also a darker undercurrent. Wolf was often used to describe dangerous or deceitful things, like werewolves, or witches, or food that lured you in only to hurt you later. You walk into a 17th century apothecary, where labels read Solanum lycopersicum, the tomato's Latin name, meaning wolf peach. It sounds noble, scientific, but underneath, it still carries the echo of mistrust. And it didn't help that tomatoes belonged to the nightshade family. That meant it shared DNA with plants like belladonna and mandrake, infamous in folklore for causing madness, visions, or even death. People weren't wrong to be cautious. They just didn't know where the line between danger and dinner lay. In some regions of England, the tomato was called a golden apple. In colonial America, some simply called it the Mexican fruit. Others lumped it with eggplants and peppers as love fruits, a vaguely scandalous category that sounded more like a Shakespearean insult than a dinner menu. You overhear debates in taverns, markets, kitchens. Is it a fruit or a vegetable? A medicine or a meal? A friend or foe? And all the while, the tomato keeps growing quietly, patiently under names both flattering and fearful. Then, in a small but significant shift, something happened. In 1893, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that tomatoes were vegetables not because of botany, they're technically fruits, but because of how they were eaten. Vegetables were taxed, fruits weren't. The court sided with the kitchen, not the science. It was one of the rare moments where linguistics, law, and lunch collided. You smirk, thinking, even the highest court in the land once had to ask, wait, what do we call this thing? Today, the tomato's name is solid. Globally, variations of tomato dominate: tomate in Spanish, pomodoro in Italian, tomat in Swedish, tomatim in Arabic, shongshu in Chinese, meaning western, red persimmon. Each name is a trail of breadcrumb of cultural adoption, translation, and evolution. Each carries echoes of suspicion, curiosity, and finally, acceptance. So when you slice into a tomato, remember, this wasn't just a food, it was a puzzle. a mystery fruit with too many names, too many opinions, and just enough flavor to win the world over. And now, that love apple sits quietly on your plate, no longer feared, just enjoyed. Asterisk, you're stirring a pot in a cramped Neapolitan kitchen in the late 1700s. Steam coils around your face. Garlic, olive oil, and a strange new ingredients, chopped tomatoes, simmer into something rich and red and utterly unthinkable a century ago. Welcome to the moment the tomato becomes not just edible, but essential. It didn't happen overnight. For generations, tomatoes were tolerated at best curiosities on the fringes of the plate. But sometime in southern Italy, in kitchens where culinary caution met necessity, people started cooking them down, slowly, lovingly, until they became sauce. This sauce had no grand marketing campaign, no royal endorsement. It spread through spoons, not scrolls. A mother passing it to her children, a neighbor trading recipes, a merchant ladling it onto flat bread. You taste it now, warm, tangy, alive, and you understand why people never looked back. Tomato sauce didn't just make food better. It made ingredients stretch further. It brought moisture to dry bread, flavor to cheap pasta, body to simple beans. It democratized deliciousness. By the early 1800s, pasta al pomodoro had emerged as a humble favorite, cheap, filling, and bursting with flavor. It was a dish of the people. No French court would touch it, but Naples sang its praises. You see it sold on corners, ladled onto wooden plates, eaten with calloused hands. And then something strange happened. Naples was conquered again. Soldiers, travelers, and bureaucrats tasted the red sauce and brought it home. Suddenly, what had been peasant food became exportable. Tomato sauce traveled north, then across oceans. Italian immigrants carried it to New York, Buenos Aires, Melbourne, in their suitcases. Maybe a photo of their grandmother, a rosary, and a memory of tomato sauce bubbling on the stove. Soon, you'd find canned tomato products in American stores, tomato paste in industrial kitchens, recipes in newspapers. Red gravy, as some called it in the U.S. South, became a Sunday tradition. Meanwhile, chefs in France and Germany grudgingly add tomato to their meat reductions. Just a hint, they say, for color. But it's not just color, it's confidence. Tomato sauce becomes the soul of dishes: lasagna, chili, shakshuka, curry, even ketchup. It transcends its poisonous past and becomes the lifeblood of comfort food across continents. And here's the irony: the very thing that once made tomatoes feared their acidities. What gives tomato sauce its culinary magic? That tempts it, brightens, stew, cuts through fat, makes everything taste more alive. You return to that Neapolitan kitchen. The pot is nearly empty. A young girl scrapes the last bit with bread. She looks up and smiles, red sauce on her cheek. She doesn't know she's part of a revolution. She just knows it tastes good. From poison apple to pantry staple. The journey was long, but the sauce, it was worth it. Asterisk, you're in a smoky New England tavern. Around 1812, a man with remarkable sideburns slams a bottle on the counter and says, "Imported from the Orient." The label reads, "Catsup," and the color, not red, it's brown, smells like anchovies in vinegar. This is ketchup's great-grandfather. See, ketchup didn't start with tomatoes. Its ancestors were fermented sauces from Southeast Asia, ketchup, in Hokkien Chinese. A kind of fish brine, tangy and umami-rich. British traders in the 17th century tasted it, panicked slightly, and then fell in love. They brought it home and immediately started making versions without understanding what it was. Imagine someone tasting soy sauce for the first time and saying, "Ah yes, this should be made with mushrooms and walnuts." That's roughly how British ketchup began, as a catch-all term for fermented savory sauces, some with beer, some with oysters, some with odd optimism, You sit down in 18th century London and order roast beef. The waiter brings horseradish, mustard, and walnut ketchup. It's sharp, earthy, not bad. But where's the tomato? It wouldn't arrive for another 100 years. The first known recipe for tomato ketchup in America appeared in 1812. It was made by a physician, naturally, who thought tomatoes were excellent for digestion. This early tomato ketchup was spiced with mace, allspice, and cloves more, like a chutney, than anything squirt-able. Then came the bottlers. By the mid-1800s, small-scale producers were cooking tomatoes down into dense concentrates, sweetening them, adding vinegar to keep them shelf-stable. But the big leap that came with Henry J. Heinz. Heinz looked at the Wild West of 19th century condiments and said, "Let's clean this up." His 1876 tomato ketchup was standardized, sweetened, vinegar bright, and shockingly consistent. It didn't spoil. It didn't separate. It didn't smell like dead anchovies. And this matters, it was in a clear glass bottle, so you could see what you were getting. Trust, bottled. Suddenly, ketchup wasn't a niche colonial condiment. It was a household staple. Heinz turned tomatoes into a brand. You fast forward to the 20th century. Ketchup is now in every diner, on every hot dog, unless you're in Chicago, beside every plate of fries. It's red, smooth, oddly addictive. But what few people realize is that ketchup's roots have nothing to do with tomatoes. The red stuff is aremix, and even the name is a confusion. Catsup and ketchup battled for decades. Some southern regions swore by catsup as the proper term. It was like the early version of the Jif versus Jif debate. Eventually, ketchup won out, partly thanks to marketing muscle. You imagine a tomato on a long voyage, from Peru to Portugal, from garden to kitchen, from suspicion to sauce, and now, reborn again as ketchup, in a squeeze bottle with a plastic cap. From fermented fish to Burger Buddy, the journey was messy, but remarkably human. And next time you smack the bottom of a Heinz bottle trying to get the last bit, remember, this humble red goo traveled across oceans, cultures, and centuries, all to end up on your plate. Asterisk, you're walking down a dusty street in colonial Virginia, mid-1700s. Children are chasing a hoop, women are hanging laundry, and in a fenced garden there it is. A tomato plant, tall and tangled. People walk past it with narrowed eyes. One woman crosses herself. Another mutters, "Which apple?" Welcome to the American colonies, where tomatoes are exotic, suspicious, and sometimes outright feared. Despite the tomatoes' rise in parts of Europe by the 1700s, many British colonists brought over the old superstitions. The poison apple narrative crossed the Atlantic along with cutlery and powdered wigs. To be fair, the colonists already had enough strange flora to contend with corn, tobacco, squash, and weren't thrilled about adding another, you peer, into a colonial cookbook. No tomatoes, not a single recipe, plenty of buttered carrots, apple puddings, and boiled meats, but the tomato omitted, as if it didn't exist. But it did. In gardens, it often appeared as an ornamental plant, grown not for eating, but for watching. With its curling stems and bright red fruits, it was admired from a distance like a tiger behind glass. Some accounts from the era described it as a love apple, or even worse, a lust fruit. Puritanical sensibilities weren't fond of anything associated with passion. Tomatoes were linked with warm climates, dark-skinned peoples, and indulgent customs. So, naturally, colonial society kept its fork at bay. But behind the fear, small revolutions were bubbling in Philadelphia. A few French-influenced cooks began experimenting with tomato stews. In the southern plantations, enslaved Africans and Caribbean workers already familiar with tomato-like fruits used them in their own cooking, often out of sight from the plantation tables. A different culinary lineage was forming, not in polished dining rooms, but in outdoor kitchens and iron pots over firewood. One of the most influential figures in tomato acceptance came in the form of a showman, literally. In 1820, a man named Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, dressed in full military regalia, stood on the courthouse steps of Salem, New Jersey. He held a basket of tomatoes. Before a confused and concerned crowd, he announced he would eat them. All of them. Gasps. A woman fainted. One man supposedly tried to stop him, crying, "You'll foam at the mouth." But Johnson, he ate them, slowly, dramatically, and lived. People waited. No vomiting, no convulsions. Just a man with tomato juice on his chin. Was it a PR stunt? Probably. Did it work? Absolutely. From that point forward, Americans began reconsidering the tomato. Slowly, of course. It still took years to fully integrate into the national cuisine. But Johnson's little stunt broke the mental spell. People began planting them not just for beauty, but for food. Tomato pie appeared. Stewed tomatoes joined. Sunday dinner. And, eventually, the tomato claimed its rightful place alongside corn and beans as a staple of American soil. You walk through an 1830s market stall now. Tomatoes are sold next to cucumbers and onions. Children nibble them raw. Housewives negotiate over price per pound. The fear, once so thick you could slice it, has thinned into nostalgia, and somewhere, Colonel Johnson is probably smiling into a bowl of tomato soup, pleased with himself. You're sitting in a dusty Kansas farmhouse in 1885. Outside, wheat rustles. Inside, dinner is being served. Fried salt pork, cornbread, beans, and at the center of the table, a bowl of fresh tomatoes. Not sliced, not sauced, whole, raw, and glowing red in the candlelight. You watch as one guest eats 3, another refuses to touch them. A third sprinkles sugar on hers, like strawberries. Welcome to America's tomato identity crisis. By the late 1800s, tomatoes were everywhere, but how to eat them was still up for debate. In the South, they were baked into pies. In the Midwest, served raw with cottage cheese. On the coasts, stewed. In immigrant neighborhoods, transformed entirely into curries, salsas, soups, and more. This was the century when tomatoes stopped being exotic and started being personal. You flip through women's magazines from the 1890s. They argue about tomatoes the way people today argue about pineapple on pizza. Best eaten peeled, one writer insists. Never raw, says another. Only from your own garden, sniffs a third. Meanwhile, the tomato plant itself was thriving. American seed catalogs from the 1890s began to feature dozens of varieties. Beefsteak, Brandywine, Cherokee Purple, each with passionate defenders. Gardeners took pride in tomato harvests the way others might show off a prize hog. But the tomato didn't just spark culinary passions. It stirred legal debates. In 1893, the U.S. Supreme Court actually ruled on whether the tomato was a fruit or a vegetable. Not joking. The case. Nix v. Hedden. You're in the courtroom. Justices in thick robes. Lawyers waving dictionaries. The issue. Import taxes. Fruit was taxed differently than vegetables. So was the tomato. Technically a fruit, going to escape higher duties. Botanists weighed in. It has seeds. It's a fruit, they said. But the court looked at how people used it, in cooking, in markets, on plates, not in pies, but with meats. The final ruling, vegetable. Not because of science, but because of dinner. This legal decision didn't change how people ate tomatoes, but it showed how deep their roots had grown. Tomatoes had gone from feared foreign oddity to courtroom drama, from backyard garden to legislative record. You sit in a diner in 1920. A waitress pours ketchup next to your fries. She doesn't ask if you want it. You just do. Tomato has become the default, but not everywhere. There were still holdouts. Pockets of tomato skepticism remained, older folks who recalled stories of poison, children who couldn't stand the texture. A few northeastern boarding schools even banned tomatoes, claiming they excite the blood. And yet, the tomato endured, because it wasn't just a food anymore. It was a flavor, a memory, a symbol of summer, of home, of resilience. You watch a child in the 1930s bite into one, like an apple. Juice drips down her arm. She grins. Fear, no drama. Just joy. A century earlier, that act might have caused panic. Now, it's just lunch. You're sitting in a quiet suburban kitchen, somewhere in 1950s America. The table is formica. The wallpaper has cherries on it, and on your plate, a grilled cheese sandwich, a pickle, and a perfect slice of tomato deep red, slightly salted, glistening under the kitchen light. This is victory. The tomato has made it. By mid-20th century, it's not just accepted, it's adored. Tomatoes are in gardens, on television ads, at school cafeterias, in cookbooks, and preserved in endless ways: canned, crushed, sun-dried, stewed, pureed. You walk into any American pantry and find rows of tomato products. It has become a culinary chameleon, but of course, no victory is without its cost. Mass production led to hardier varieties, bred for shipping, not taste. Tomatoes became redder, rounder, and tragically, blander. Flavor was sacrificed on the altar of convenience. Supermarket tomatoes, picked green and ripened with ethylene gas, looked like perfection, but tasted like cardboard. Still, the tomato held on. In immigrant kitchens across America, tomatoes simmered in pots for hours. Sicilian grandmothers crushed them by hand. Mexican salsas danced with chili and lime. Southern gumbos used them to thicken. The tomato, in every cuisine, found its voice. Meanwhile, scientific studies flipped the fear on its head. Where once tomatoes were called deadly, now they were found to contain lycopene, an antioxidant. Suddenly, your grandmother's tomato soup wasn't just comfort food, it was health food. You hear someone on the radio, eat tomatoes to live longer. The irony isn't lost on you. From the poison apple myth, to the Supreme Court, to the ketchup bottle, the tomato has traveled further than most humans ever will. It has been doubted, debated, exported, embraced, industrialized, romanticized, and repackaged. And through it all, it remained what it always was, a fruit. Yes, but mostly, a survivor. Today, you eat cherry tomatoes from a plastic clamshell, sitting at your desk, not thinking twice. But tomorrow, you'll pass a garden and smell the vine, and some ancient part of you, some soft, human part, will feel a kind of quiet awe, because the tomato isn't just food. It's a story of suspicion and surprise, of mislabeling and persistence, of science and superstition, of red juice staining linen and memories alike. And in that story, you find something strangely comforting, familiar, almost sleepy. So next time you slice into a tomato, maybe take a breath. Imagine a time when doing so might have been considered an act of rebellion, or bravery, or insanity. And now, it's just dinner. And now, as your eyelids begin to feel just a bit heavier, and the hum of your world softens into a slow, familiar rhythm, let the story settle around you like warm soup on a rainy day. You've walked through centuries tonight, crossed oceans, witnessed courtrooms and gardens, fear and flavor, myth and memory. The tomato, humble, bright, and oddly poetic, has carried us here, gently, to this quiet moment. So if your breath is slow, your room dim, and your heart just a little calmer than before, maybe that's the real magic of history. Not in the battles or kings, but in the stories we carry in the simplest of things, like a slice of tomato.